This is lecture 4 in our series on federalism of 5 lectures. And in this lecture, we will talk about the evolution of federalism in the United States. Remember, I talked in an earlier lecture about federalism as a relationship. Keep in mind, in the beginning, they were figuring this all out. The Constitution was written to very specifically list what the national government could do. And they didn't worry about what the states could do. You know, the states had their own constitutions, and they really sort of thought, for the most part, they were just going to operate like they always had. But now you've got a situation really of sort of shared sovereignty, with the national government having sovereignty or authority to rule without consulting anyone else, and the states having a form of sovereignty at the same time. So that's going to lead to conflicts. The founders were smart enough to put the supremacy clause in to try to resolve those conflicts, but there's still going to be very much a give and take as this relationship evolves and develops. Now, there are two basic philosophies on how this power is granted to the different levels of government. One position is the states' rights position. This idea, or people who believe this, believe that the powers that the national government hold are powers that it was granted by the states. They believe the Constitution is a compact between the national government and the states, and they'll use the 10th Amendment as justification for that. It's this idea that the states were giving up power to this new central government, and therefore sort of the national government was answerable to the states. This idea, led by people like Justice Taney, who was appointed by Andrew Jackson in the 1830s, that will lead the first wave of changes from the original relationship. The other position, though, and actually the states' rights position was a little bit of the anti-federalist position. The nationalist position, on the other hand, believes that the power of the national government is granted to it by the people. And they'll say, you know, the Constitution doesn't start out, we the states. It starts out, we the people. And so they believe the Constitution is a compact or an agreement, a social contract between the people and the national government. And the states are sort of ancillary to that. And their justification for that will be in part the idea that the founders did give the elastic clause in the Constitution, which would allow for federal expansion of power. And this is really more of the federalist perspective. Now, all of this is going to be open for interpretation as time progresses. So the first era is that of expansive federalism. And this will be really from about 1789 to 1857 or so. One of the first Chief Justices, and one of probably the most influential justice in the history of the U.S. Supreme Court, was John C. Marshall. And they name courts by who the Chief Justice is, so you'll hear it referenced as the Marshall Court. He took a very expansive view, and he'll give us cases like McCulloch versus Maryland and Gibbons v. Ogden, all of which led to an idea that the elastic clause is perfectly justified. The national government needs a bank, it can have a bank. Expansion of interstate commerce, it paves the way for, westward expansion, the Louisiana Purchase, etc. And this reflected sort of that battle of the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists, and the Federalists are really going to control things predominantly for quite a while there. This will shift at the point that Marshall dies, and Andrew Jackson is able to appoint a new Chief Justice. He, of course, is a Democratic Republican, or the New Democrats. And he will appoint Justice Taney, a Southern justice from Virginia, and he is a slave owner, and he's very much a states' rights advocate, and he's going to try to hold the line or stop or control that expansive national power in favor of the reserved powers of the state, trying to shift that balance back to the states. The Dred Scott case in 1857, which was the first decision of the Supreme Court to overturn an entire federal law, the Missouri Compromise, is really a watershed decision. And of course, it leads to the Civil War, where we begin to answer this question about federal supremacy in the Civil War and its aftermath. Now, from that point forward, the court will begin to interpret the relationship as one of dual federalism. Dual meaning two. And the definition here would be a system of government in which both the states and the national government are supreme within their own spheres. So, look at like a Venn diagram. You've got that concurrent, and there are some concurrent powers, but for the most part, the national government has power over what's in the Constitution, and the states have power over what's not in the Constitution, and there's not a whole lot of overlap. They're really going to hold the line. This has been described commonly as a layer cake interpretation. If you look at that picture of a layer cake, you see those very careful delineation of each layer of icing and cake. I tend to think of the icing as being like the federal government because they are supreme, but and then the cake would be the separate states, and you don't see much overlap there until you take a bite. This will lead to a narrow interpretation of federal powers, and it will last until the Great Depression and the New Deal. And at that point, we will move into an era that is known as cooperative federalism. This is a system in which powers and policy assignments are shared more. You'll see an expansion of the powers of the federal government. Programs will begin to have shared costs and shared implementation and administration of those programs. This will lead to a scenario where the federal government creates programs, it shares resources and money and personnel, etc., with the states, but at the same time, the federal government will make regulations about how those programs are supposed to be enacted and how that money is supposed to be spent. Of course, during the New Deal, the states were so devastated. They were thrilled to have this infusion of the national treasury. Keep in mind, we'd been collecting income taxes since just the 19-teens. The national government had a huge surplus of money from those income taxes that had been coming in. The states did not have that surplus, obviously, and were hurting. So it was there was a very favorable impression to the national government taking on a larger role and expanding their power and cooperating. Okay, the analogy for this one is often that of a marble cake. Now I've got a picture there of a marble cake. Notice how they swirl together, and it's harder to tell where one starts and where the other ends. So let's review. How are these like cake? On the left, we have that layer cake, and that is intended to describe the period of dual federalism. Again, meaning two. So you have that clear delineation of your cake layers and your frosting layers, and they don't mix. Okay, so that describes how the national government had its sphere of influence and things that it had control over, and the states had their areas of control, and there really isn't any mixing. Okay, on the right, we have cooperative federalism. This one's more like a marble cake, and you notice how the layers swirl together. You still have the frosting on the outside, okay, which I think of the frosting as the federal government, and so it's still supreme, but inside you have that swirling mix, and it's not predictable. And so in some areas the states are more powerful, or they're in control of things. In some, the national is in power and control of things, and they just kind of swirl together. Okay? Hopefully that's clear. Think about other analogies you might be able to come up with for this relationship. Not food ones, those are kind of covered, but think about other analogies that make sense to you to describe this. So how does this relationship work today? There have been other incarnations of the relationship and other descriptions of the relationship. One is called New Federalism. That really, New Federalism came about starting with the Nixon administration and really took it grew legs, and it went somewhere during the Reagan administration. The idea behind New Federalism was that you should shift programs from national to state control. At the same time, you'll see a shift in the types of grants that are given. That's in the next lecture. And you'll see a shift in size of government. I didn't include the chart. Maybe I can get one more slide in here that shows the size of the federal government in relation to state governments before New Federalism and after New Federalism. So under New Federalism, they'll shift more of the decision-making of programs down to the states, and they'll shift more of the implementation of programs down to the states. That has positives and negatives. It decreases the size and expenditures of the national government, but it ends up increasing the size of state government and the expenditures expected of state government, which has led to some of the financial and fiscal woes that the states are facing in this day and age. Another way of looking at this through this period is something called coercive federalism. The national government, keep in mind, when the national government gives money, and let's put these two together, fiscal and coercive, these sort of follow along with the new federalism. As you shift programs from national to state, and you shift money, the issue is, though, that there's no such thing as a free lunch. The government's not going to give money to the states or give power to the states without retaining some of it. Okay? So they began telling the states, well, here's how you implement. And if you want this money, you have to do what we say. And gee, if you don't do what we say, we take away the money. And, you know, this is discussed a whole lot more in the next lecture, so I'm not going to go into it anymore. But these are some of the other descriptions. And after you look at this next lesson, you know, that might be a way for you to, I think one of the level 1 or level 2 activities, I don't remember right now which one, asks you to do sort of a timeline. You can do an illustrated timeline of the relationship. This is a really good way and a good thing to look at in creating that timeline to really understand where federalism's going. If you understand federalism in the United States, you understand policy making in the United States government. This is a key unit to understand because it will drive and help you understand the rest of this course right up to graduation. Now today this relationship takes on two very primary characteristics. Number one, the states have begun, after cooperative federalism, they rely on federal assistance, both with programs, things like Medicaid, which is a health program for the poor. Health and welfare were definitely powers of the states, but starting in the 60s when we created Medicaid as a federal program, you know, there's been that cooperative effort between national funds and state administration. Additionally, disaster response. Think about things like 9/11, things like Katrina, tornadoes that have hit in Birmingham, or the recent ice storms. States have begun to rely on the larger resources and capability of the national government to help them pay for the cleanup in these devastating events. And that shift occurred under cooperative federalism. Secondly, the federal government counts on the fact that states will rely on their money because it helps them to gain power in ways that they would not normally have had. Remember, under dual federalism, it was national powers, state powers, they don't mix. As the national government begins to give money to the states, they begin to employ what's sometimes called as a carrot and stick approach. This is a vocab term, actually. And this carrot and stick, think of the farmer with the mule. You know, mules habitually don't want to go where you want them to go, and so you get this image of the farmer dangling a carrot on a stick in front of the mule's face to get him to move forward for the reward. This is sort of how this financial relationship works. The national government dangles money. The states want the money because they want to increase the services that they can offer to their people, and so they follow that carrot and they end up being led to where the federal government wants them to be. For the federal government, the benefit they get is increased control and power in areas that are not constitutionally theirs. And of course, for the states, they get the reelectability of, look what great programs we bring you. You want to live here. You want to locate your businesses here. You know, this is a great place to live. So think of the relationships in that way. And then finally, pause this, look at these questions, and be prepared to discuss them in a face-to-face interview if you choose to do that, and put your answers in your notes.